All right, so recording started. So let's get started. So today we are going to be talking about Composer and like how we can actually leverage Composer. Let me share my screen. Oh yes. Okay. Is everybody able to see my screen properly? All right. Super. So the idea is like we will actually be talking about um, Composer, and then also see like how we will be able to use Composer for in WordPress projects. So the reason why we actually thought of doing this topic is because for two reasons. One is like obviously Composer is a very famous tool in the PHP world, but not a lot of people use it in the WordPress ecosystem yet. But like slowly people have started using it. But in the PHP ecosystem, Composer is like very popular, and like a lot of people actually use it. And with when WordPress in the recent versions of WordPress, when they stopped supporting PHP 5.2 and like started supporting PHP 5.3 and above. Now we can actually use Composer in like all versions of PHP that are supported by WordPress, because like I think Composer has a minimum dependency of 5.3, and since WordPress was trying to support 5.2 earlier, it became difficult for us to use Composer in WordPress. But now that's all not there anymore. Those restrictions are not there anymore. A lot of people have started using Composer. So and it's very powerful also from a dependency management perspective. So we thought we would do that, and like to start the workshop series with that. So as I said, like we're going to be talking about Composer and like how we can use Composer in WordPress projects. And by the way, my name is Sudar. I'm part of the WP Chennai community. I was born and brought up in Chennai and been here pretty much most of my life here. And let's get started. Okay, so what is Composer, right? So Composer is actually a dependency tool, or a package manager. Basically what it does is like if you have your own projects, and if your project actually depends on multiple other dependencies, like, or when I say dependency, it could be like a code dependency like a library, or it could be other dependencies, like it could probably depend on an executable and other things, or it could even be like your project would require, let's say, PHP 7.1 or 7.2, right? So in case if somebody is trying to install your project on a version which is less than that, then that could be a problem. So even your PHP version could be a dependency, or any extensions in PHP could be a dependency as well. But most of the time, when we say dependency for a project, it actually refers to a source code or a library on which your project depends on. So what Composer allows us to do is basically it is a dependency manager. Basically allows us to manage our dependencies pretty well. And also, if we have to deploy our code in multiple different systems, then it actually allows us to install the same version of our dependencies in all the different places, maybe in our dev machines, maybe in the staging server, in the production server, and like everywhere. So that is one advantage of Composer. The other major advantage is like if our dependencies have additional dependencies, right? So in case like we depend on library one, but the library one depends on, let's say, another couple of libraries. Then in that case, in that case, Composer actually makes it possible to manage not just our dependencies, but also the other dependencies which our library depends on. So it has this whole way of managing everything that is needed for our code. So that is like the main advantage of Composer. And as I said, it's pretty popular in the PHP ecosystem. And the packages that are that can be installed using Composer or maintained in a website called package list. Let me stop sharing, or let me stop the PowerPoint and show you what I mean by that. So this is the website where all the libraries are listed. So we could search for different libraries. So I'm just going to be, I was just like searching for string. So you could see like these are different libraries that we have, which are actually which allows us to do some string manipulations and things like that. So in case if we want to do something about JSON, we'll actually be able to see all these different libraries that actually provide some additional functionality around JSON. So this is like a repository where we can actually see the different packages or libraries that are available which we can use. So in addition to whatever things that is listed in package list, Composer also has the ability to pick things from GitHub directly. So for example, like if we actually use this as a dependency, first it will check package list to see if a package is published with this name. If not, then it will directly go to GitHub to see if there is a package with this name, like with that username and package name. And if it's available, then it will actually start downloading that as well. Okay, so let's quickly try a couple of things with Composer to get an hands-on feeling of how to use Composer. Right. So what I'm actually going to do is basically just I have a WordPress site set up here, but I'm not going to be using WordPress for this part of the demo. Let's just create a folder called Compose test or something. So let's assume that this is our project folder, right? So we are going to be using Compose in this. So right now, as this is it's a new folder, so there's nothing here. So we are going to be, and I have already installed Composer, and I'm not going to be covering about installing Composer, but it's pretty easy. Like you should be able to get it installed in like less than a minute. So I'm going to run a command called Composer init, and what it is going to do is basically set up Composer for this project. Okay. So when I run this, it's actually going to ask me what is going to be the name of the package. Typically, the name of the package has two components. One is like the name or the vendor. In this case, it could be a user. It could be a user. It could be a company or any unique identifier for the vendor part, and then the actual package name. So in this case, it's going to be Sudar /composer test. I'm going to just leave the default. I'm not going to change it. So next we have to type the description. I'm going to say composer demo or something like that. And then it will try to autofill the author name. And then there's something called minimum stability, where I won't get too deep into it, but it basically kind of specifies what should be the stability of the packages that we try to install. I'll probably try to cover that at a later point in time. Next, we have the package type. So there could be a library or a project or a Composer plugin or a meta package. So in this case, we will just go with a project. And then license, I typically like the beerware license. In case if you don't know what it is, you could probably search for it. It's a very interesting license, which I tend to use a lot. And yeah, we can also specify our dependencies right now, but I'm not going to do it right now, but so I'm just going to say no for all of this. So now what Composer has done is basically generated a file. Yeah, so this is going to be the Composer configuration, and it's actually asking me whether this is fine. If I say yes, it's actually going to create a file called composer.json, which will have all this information. So let's quickly see that file. Where did we do that? Reload from this composer.json. Yeah, so this is the file that Composer has created for us. And as you can see, right now there is no dependency. Like the dependencies are specified inside this section, which is required. And as of now, like it's empty. So we don't have any dependency for this project. Okay, now what we'll do is let's pick up some library that we can use. For string manipulation, there used to be a package from Symfony. I think it's called Symfony. Oh, I have this open here. It's called Symfony String. Let's search for that. Yeah, so this is the package. So let's just try to install this package. This package basically allows us to do a lot of string manipulation. So this is the GitHub home page. So this is the documentation for that package. So basically we need to run this command to install it. So the command is composer require and then the dependency name. In our case, the dependency is symphony/string. So we're gonna just require that. So now what Composer is going to do is basically retrieve this dependency. And as you can see, like this particular package also has other dependencies or sub dependencies. So these are the additional packages that this string package depends on. So these things are loaded, and Composer would have also created another file called composer.log. So basically, Composer has two files. One is the composer.json, another one is composer.log. Let's quickly see it here. So the composer.json is the human readable part of, or is a human readable configuration file. It's for basically human consumption, like we would be able to see it. And then there is also this log file, which is generally for machine consumption, or like basically for Composer to understand it, right? And both are actually in JSON format. And here now you can see that in the require section, this new package that we included got specified, and it is also specifying the version of the package that needs to be installed, right? And and Composer also has abilities by which we can specify different constraints for the version. For example, the caret symbol, which is before this version here, right? So this basically specifies that Composer can install any version that is compatible with 5.1. So the versioning actually follows semantic versioning. Basically, in semantic versioning, we have three components for any version string. So we'll have a major version, a minor version, and then the patch version. So in case if I say 5.0.0, here 5 would be the major version, 1 is the minimum, 1 is the minor version, and 0 is the patch version. And the semantic versioning is basically used to understand how the packages are going to be compatible across different versions. So for example, 5.1 would be actually compatible with 5.2, whereas it may not be compatible with 4.1. So if the major version changes, then it may not be compatible anymore, and things like that. So you can read up about the semantic versioning. And basically now what it actually says is like install any version which is compatible with 5.1. I can also do something like just say I want exactly 5.4 or 5.1.4 or something like that. So this, in this case, it will install this exact patch version. I can also do something like tilde, um, which would also like install something. Actually kind of confusing the difference between tilde and caret right now, but I think one of them would be compatible with the version, and the other one is, I think caret basically means up to this version, and tilde is like will install anything which is compatible with this version. So you can read about all the different versioning schemes that Composer follows. Um, okay, let me just change it back to caret here. And if you look at the composer.log file, we can actually see, if we search for string, we'll actually be able to see the exact version of that got installed. So yeah, so the exact version that got installed was 5.1.2. So in case if there is a patch that got released for 5.1.3, next time when we do Composer update, that will get pulled in as well. And just about all these changes. And we can also see like these dependencies, right, have been pulled into a folder called vendor. So if we look into the vendor folder, so we can see the actual string library got loaded here. So it has all the classes and other things here. And these are the other dependencies. So, and since all the other dependencies are also inside the Symfony namespace, like we can see all of them here. In case if it also dependent on some other namespace, like then those things would get created here. Okay. So now let's quickly try to use this library, right? I'm going to create a new PHP file let's call it string test. And what I'm going to do is just try some of the examples from the string. Okay. So here, so we are basically going to be using a class called Unicode string, and we will be specifying a string, and then we can trim the text that is at the end, and then replace it and then append. So now this text will have this variable will have the modified text, and then we can echo it, and then we can try it out. But you can see that this is my source file, but I'm saying that I need this class, but I'm not actually including this class or including the file in which this class is present, right? Usually what we do is we would do something like, require and specify where the file is, right? Vendor. In case if we downloaded this library, then we will go to string, then try to see where that file is, Symfony string, and this class, right? Unicode string should be inside components somewhere. But now the problem is, like, if there are multiple classes, then we cannot actually have like we cannot like individually require, or we cannot try to individually require all these classes, right? And what Composer does now is, like, it actually creates something called an auto load file. So if you look inside the vendor directory, it has already created a file called autoload.php. What this will do is basically use PHP's auto load functionality and then include all the dependency files, all the dependency libraries that got pulled in. Okay, so all we need to do now is just say require once vendor / autoload.php, and that's all we need to do. Even in case if we are going to be using more classes from this library, we don't need to manually include any other file. Okay, so let's just comment this for now, and I'm gonna try. So we will get an error, and if I enable this and then try, it's actually going to print the string, right? So in addition to maintaining the dependencies or allowing us to download the dependencies, it also actually creates this auto load. Composer also creates this auto load file, so that we can automatically load all the dependencies that we have downloaded using PHP's auto load functionality. Okay, so this is a brief introduction about Composer. We've not gotten into the WordPress part yet. Going back to the presentation, yeah, so we've covered what is Composer, like, yeah, the packages. Yeah, then another important thing is, like, whenever we are specifying the dependencies, right, in a Composer file, there are two types of dependencies. One is like the normal dependencies, which we will specify using require. Then we will also have a special type of dependencies called dev dependencies. Okay, so those we will be using something like this require dev. So the difference between these two things is that um, the so any dependency that we have inside require, that is directly used in our source code, or whenever we are doing the production deployment or something like that, right? So we definitely need to install those dependencies. And anything that we have inside the dev, these dev dependencies are usually the tools that are used in development and may not be installed in production. Okay. For example, maybe we are doing some unit testing, right? So maybe we are using PHP unit and then doing some unit testing. When the code is actually deployed in the server, we are not actually going to be using unit testing. It's mostly for development, right? The other example could be PHP CS or the code, PHP code sniffer, right? It's a static code analyzer tool which would automatically analyze the PHP source code for us. So those are things that we would use for development and not in actual production, right? So the dependencies that we require only for development, we can actually put them inside the dev dependencies inside the require-dev part of the JSON file, and things that we actually require for the dependencies that we actually require in production, we would actually bring them inside the require part of the JSON file. Okay. So yeah, we've covered that. And as I said, some of the useful things from Composer, we don't need to include the libraries in our source code, right? So now all the dependencies for this particular project is maintained within this JSON file alone. And anywhere, either if we have to share this project with our teammate, or if we have to deploy it on a staging server or in production server, we don't have to include the dependencies, like all these files which are inside the vendor directory, in our source code, like in our source control system. Maybe like if you're using Git, we don't need to include all those additional files. All we need to do is like just include the composer.json file, and wherever we need it, maybe if it's our teammate or in the staging server, we just need to run the composer install command to automatically pull in all the dependencies. So that's like the first advantage. The other thing is like all these dependencies are now installed within the vendor directory, right? In case if there is some problem, I can just delete this directory and then regenerate it. And I don't have to install anything globally in my machine. And the other advantage is like in case if I'm working on two different projects which require two different versions of the library, then I don't have to. I mean, if I install it globally, then it becomes there would be like conflicts and other things. But here, everything is just maintained within my project directory. And the other advantage obviously is like handle the dependencies very easily. And the other one, as I mentioned, is like ability to get the same version of the library everywhere, be it on your teammates machine, staging server, production server, CI server, wherever, right? And I also demonstrated how we can use auto loading so that we don't have to manually keep track of including all the files everywhere. So all we need to do is just include the auto load.php file, and Composer would automatically take care of dynamically loading all the class files for us. And obviously the other thing is like now that we have this ability of using libraries, now what you can also do is like whenever you're working on a slightly bigger project, if you have different components, you can also package them as different packages, or package these components as packages and then release them or reuse them across your projects. Now it becomes very easy for your code, or for you to create libraries out of your code and then distribute them. If Composer is not available, then it becomes difficult, right? Because if you have to use the same class across multiple projects, then most of the time you might just try to copy paste the same class everywhere. But in case if you have to make changes to that, then you have to manually keep track of wherever that class is used, and then try to update it everywhere. But if we maintain it through Composer, then all we need to do is release a new version and then update it in composer.json. Okay. So we are almost halfway through, and I think with now that we have like a basic understanding of Composer, we'll move on to how we can leverage Composer in our WordPress projects, right? So there are multiple ways by which we can make use of Composer in WordPress. One is when we think about a WordPress project, what are all the dependencies on a WordPress project, right? When I say WordPress project, assume that you have a WordPress site. What are all going to be the dependencies? Obviously, the plugins, the third-party plugins and themes that we are using in our site is actually a dependency, right? So those dependencies can be maintained using Composer. The second thing that we can do is basically whenever we are creating our own theme, our plugin, and then in those plugin we need to include third-party libraries or dependencies. Then those can also be maintained using Composer. And the third thing is like obviously when you have like let's say you are a company, and in your company like you have created certain plugins which needs to be installed on all your sites, right? So or if you have created some code that needs to be shared with all your projects, then it becomes easy, or you could make use of Composer to do that within your plugin or themes. And then there is also another use case where you could install WordPress itself through Composer. So like, and I generally don't use the last option that's there, and it could be useful in when we have to set up WordPress in CI server and other places. But generally, for production servers, I don't use Composer to set up WordPress itself. The main reason being WordPress is generally available most of the. I mean, like you're going to be installing WordPress only once, right? And then all the other plugins and themes you're going to be maintaining those dependencies again and again. So I don't personally use that, but I've seen a lot of people do that, where they actually install WordPress itself as a Composer dependency uh, through Composer. And one obvious advantage of using that is like if you're running a continuous integration server, where anytime you push your code and you need to automatically test it and then deploy it, right? If you have your own continuous integration pipelines, in those cases, you can actually use Composer to automatically set up WordPress and then continue your CI pipeline. Okay, now let's look at each of these things, and I'll actually show you like how we can actually use each of the things that I mentioned. The first thing that we're going to see is like how how we can actually manage themes and plugins on a site, right? So similar to like how I mentioned, we have something called package list, which contains or which is a repository of all the Composer packages that are available. There is also something called WP package list, which is basically it actually contains all the plugins and themes that are in the WordPress repository, right? So WordPress has the plugins repository, right? The WordPress.org. So all the plugins and themes that are available here are available as Composer packages in WP package list. I think this is maintained by a company called Outlandish, and so they automatically sync the SVN repo from WordPress.org and have all the plugins and themes available here. So with using that, we'll actually be able to pull in any third-party plugins and themes into our WordPress site. Okay, I'm going to quickly show how that is done. So I'll get back to the WordPress installation. So this is a WordPress install that I just set up using WP local Docker, and you can see this has the WordPress files. So you have the WP admin, WP content, and other places. So let's get inside the WP content directory. So here we will have the plugins, themes, and everything, right? So what now we are going to do is basically use Composer to maintain all these things. Okay. So as we did earlier, I'm going to be initializing Composer using the Composer init command. Let's call this as sudar/demo site. Demo site. Let's call this project. License, since it's WordPress, let's go with GPL. Okay, interactive no. Now the Composer file is generated for us. So if we go inside the WP content directory, we can see the Composer file. Let me just close the other ones. Right, so this is the barebone Composer file that's been generated for us. We need to add certain things to make sure that we have the ability to pull from WP package list repository, right? Okay, so I'm gonna quickly add those things here. Okay. Somewhere, let's just pull it. So what we need to do is basically copy the repository settings. What this basically says is that in addition to package list repository, we would also like to pull in from the WP package gist repository. I always have hard time pronouncing this, but I like to call it as WP package gist, but I think I really don't know how to pronounce this though. Anyway, so once we are done, once we add this, now what we can actually do is basically get uh, like any plugin that we have, right? Let's say if it's the any plugin that is there in the WordPress.org repo, all we need to do is just take the slug of it. Let's say BBPress, right? So this is the slug. And what we need to do is use the vendor name as WP package guest -plugin and then the slug for the plugin. Okay, so let's do this now. I'm going to say composer require. Let's copy this. And let's say BBPress. Okay. Now what Composer is actually going to do is basically retrieve this file. Okay. So yeah, so Composer has retrieved it for us. Okay, and it will be inside the vendor directory. So if we look inside the okay, let's quickly check where it is. Yeah, so you can see that Composer has automatically added added the plugin inside the require section. And let's quickly check where we are. So you can also see that the log file has also been generated. Okay, and we are here. And by default, the plugins are installed in this directory, inside the WP content plugins directory. But you can see that we were already inside the WP content directory, right? So we want to install it inside plugins directory and not inside WP content. Because if we had initialized WordPress, if we have initialized Composer here, then by default it would have gotten into WP content and plugins directory. But since we initialized Composer inside WP content, it's now creating this duplicate directory for us. So let's fix that quickly. So Composer has a directive by which we can specify where the different types of packages should be installed. Okay, so let's try to do that quickly. Okay, I had copied that somewhere. Let me see if there is there in my clipboard. Oh yeah, so it's there here. Let's remove this. So we just need to add another directive to the composer JSON file called extra and then specify the install path. So we're going to basically say that for any package which is of type WordPress plugin, install it inside the plugins directory, right? And any package which is of type WordPress theme, install it inside the themes directory. Now what we will do is go back here. So I've deleted the vendor and WP content directory. And now I'm going to do composer install. And let's quickly check if everything got installed properly. So when I say plugins, yeah, so the BB Press plugin got installed properly here, right? So let's try to install another theme. Let's go search for a theme. Let's pick generate press. So we're going to copy the slug. So we're going to say composer require package list theme and generate press. And what composer is going to do is basically download this theme into the themes directory. Let's wait for this to complete. Yeah, so this is done. If we look into the themes directory, now we see that this plugin got installed here. And if you look at the composer.json file, we can see that composer has automatically included the theme as a dependency here. Okay. So this is a quick way by which we can handle both plugins and themes as a dependency. So let's say that we have developed a site. Um, uh, let's say we have developed a WordPress site where we have like a lot of plugins and themes as dependencies. So we could just mention all of this here. And in our source code repository, all we need to do is just check in the composer.json and composer.log file, and we can just run composer install command anywhere, like maybe on the staging server or in the production server, and then it will automatically pull in the plugins and themes. And in case if we have set up continuous integration and deployments, auto deployments, right? So in our local, whenever there is a plugin update, we could test it locally in our machine, and once we feel that it is good and it works, let's say like maybe BB Press released a update for 2.7, right? So we could test it locally, and if we are fine with it, we could just change it to 2.7, check it into our repository, and like if we have automatic deployments set up, then it will auto deploy this update into the production. Okay. So this is how we actually use plugins and themes as dependencies for the WordPress site. So yeah, let's go back to the presentation. So this is what I said, like you basically have to use the WordPress package list and configure the install paths for the plugins and themes. So by default, it will install it inside the WP content/plugins directory, and that will be in relative to your current directory. So if you are if you're keeping your composer.json file in the home directory of WordPress, then you don't have to make any changes. But if you, like me, prefer to keep your composer.json inside the WP content directory, then you might have to just include or set up the installer path, and Composer will automatically take care of things. And once that is done, we just need to install any plugin or theme as a dependency. Now here, as I said, this is useful if we are going to be using plugins and themes that are already available in the WordPress.org repository, right? In case if we are using any pro versions of the plugin, right? In those cases, there are two options for us. I think some plugin providers like WP Migrate DB and other people, like they also provide a Composer repositories for the pro plugins that you buy. In those cases, we can add those dependencies as a repository here and then use it. In case that's not available, right? and let's say we are directly want to install a plugin from GitHub, then that is also possible. So in those cases, if the plugin is available in GitHub, all we need to do is basically specify the GitHub username and then the plugin name, and it will automatically install. But if it's only a pro version where we don't have, I mean, we have only a zip file, then that's also possible. Like Composer allows us to like how we have specified different repositories here, right? Composer also has a way by which we could specify a zip file as a repository, and then we could install it from there as well. So the workflow in those cases will be, you would download the updated file the from the plugin store wherever you have brought the plugin, and then have the zip file in your directory, and then run the Composer update command. Okay. So let's quickly move on. So the next use case that I was about to talk is in case if you are creating your own plugin or your own theme, right? How do we make use of Composer there? So the use case here is like in case if you're creating a plugin where you have dependencies on other third-party SDKs or libraries, right? So in those cases, what you can do is basically create like similar to like how we did in the normal Composer project, right? The one that we tried here, this Composer test, right? Similar to this, inside your plugin directory, you will just create a composer.json file, and then you can automatically include any dependencies that you need. So let's say we go to the plugins directory, we want to create a plugin called WP Chennai or something like that. So we can go here, we can run Composer init here, and like follow all the options here. Actually, here we can say this as WordPress plugin, and so this will generate. This will actually generate the composer.json file for us. And in case, let's say we are including AWS SDK, let's just check for something. In case if we are using this in our plugin, right? So all we need to do is run this command. This will download the AWS SDK into our vendor directory. And in our plugin, so this is also going to install all the dependencies. And in our plugin, let's just see. So this is going to be our main. This is our main plugin, right? So let's say we have all these things filled up. We could just do and now all the classes inside the AWS SDK would be available for us. And what we can do is like in the root file for our plugin, we can do this, or we could also include it as part of the PHP autoloader. And once we have done this, like all the classes which are inside the vendor directory, right? All these classes, all those things would be available for us automatically inside our plugin. Okay. The same thing applies for theme. The only difference would be like when we're creating the composer JSON file, we just need to specify the type as theme. And the reason why we are specifying the type as WordPress plugin or WordPress theme is because whoever is actually going to be using our plugin in their site, right? So when they install it, it will automatically get installed into the proper directory. So that is the reason why we need to specify the type here as WordPress plugin or WordPress theme. Yeah, so as I said, just create a composer.json file inside the plugin. We have to declare the dependencies, and then we can run the composer install command. and include the autoload.php file. So once we have done these steps, we would actually be able to use those third-party libraries into in our code base. Okay. So the next is sharing code across our plugins or across our themes, right? So this is a use case where let's say like we have multiple plugins which we have developed, and we require a common functionality across all these different plugins. So in those cases, instead of copying that functionality across multiple plugins, what we can do is just create a package, a composer package, and then include it in all our plugins. So I have one example here where I have done this. So let me quickly show that. So I have a couple of plugins, and in most of the plugins, I have a module called System Info, which is basically going to display details about the current WordPress installation, like things like what is the WordPress version, PHP version, and things like that. Suppose in case people who have installed my plugin have issues with their plugin, issues with my plugin, and then require support, instead of asking them like where all these what are all the details for what are all the details that are what the details about their website, right? Like the PHP version, WordPress version, what are the plugins that they installed and things like that. So I provide a small option in the menu where when they click that, it will actually generate a small text file which contains all this information. And I needed this across a lot of my plugins. So instead of copying this in like copy pasting these classes everywhere, what I did is like basically created a library. I call it WP System Info, and what I've done is like basically included that in all my other plugins. So for example, if you look at my email log plugin, so I would have included that here. So you can see here, yeah. So I'm just including that library here. I think I've also included that in one of my other plugins. Yeah, even in this plugin, if you can see, like I'm actually including that here, right?
So
So
can you please zoom your screen, Sudhar?
oh, okay, thanks. So I'm just showing you this from GitHub. Yeah, so basically what I have done is like in my composer.json file, for both my other plugins, I'm just including that here. Right. So in addition to like other dependencies that I'm using, and as I said, like these are the other dev dependencies, right? So these are like these dependencies I use for running unit test cases and other things, and these are not going to be packaged in the final zip file, but anything that I've specified here would be packaged as part of the final zip file that's going to be uploaded to the WordPress repo. You can also see that I've included PHP as a dependency here. The reason is like in case if I try to refine, or if me or somebody else tries to install this, install the or try to install install or sorry try to run the composer install command on any particular installation where the PHP version is less than 5.6, then it will straight away give an error because the code assumes that PHP 5.6 is available. So in addition to libraries, we could also specify other constraints as requirements here. Okay. So moving on. Yeah, so the other option, as I said, is like where you can install WordPress itself through Composer. So John Block actually maintains a WordPress Composer for, so you can actually see that here. And basically what it actually does is like you'll be able to install Composer itself. There is also a package list available, so all you need to do is like the Composer require John Block /WordPress, and when you do that, it will install WordPress in the directory where you are running that command. Okay. You could explore this if you have to set up WordPress quickly in your CI server or test server, right? And if you have to or if you have to set up WordPress without any manual intervention inside using a script or something like that, then in those cases you can actually try this. All right. moving on. So these are some more things that you can try. I've not covered these things here, but these are other things that you can try. As I said, like, you could set up auto deployments. So that's one popular use case. Pretty much most of the sites that all my like personal sites, I have auto deployments. So whenever I have to update a plugin or theme, I would first test it locally to make sure that it works, and then update the version number in Composer, and then check it into Git, and then it will automatically deploy it on my servers. WordPress also has a auto update facility for plugins and themes. But the problem there is, like, if you're going to be doing that directly in your production server, you would actually not be testing it, right? So I generally like test it first before deploying it to production. So that's one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is basically, I said, like, any dependencies that we use, like the AWS SDK or something like that, right? We could install it. I mean, we could get it down into our vendor directory and then use it. But assume that you are doing this for your plugin, and then somebody is using your plugin in a site, and there is also like other plugins which are also having the same library, right? Then there's going to be a name collision that's going to happen. So in those cases, what you can do is, like, there is a tool called PHP Scope, and what it allows you to do is, if for all your dependencies, it would actually add a namespace on top of the existing namespace, such that like, even if two plugins in the same site use the same library, there won't be any name collision that happens. So I have a link here, so you could, like, try that out as well. Another thing that you can do is, Composer also has something called scripts. So what these things allow you to do is, if you have to perform any operations, like, any task, like if you need to do any build task or something like that, right? You could specify them as scripts in Composer, and then run commands like composer run whatever is your script name, and then Composer will actually be able to trigger those scripts. So you could use that for automatic deployments. The other option is, like, whenever, let's say, after you install a particular dependency, you have to perform some copy operation. Like, you have to copy some files from there to another place or things like that, right? So those things can also be automated by using Composer scripts. Okay, so that's another popular use case that you can try. So yeah, so those are the things that I actually wanted to show you. And thank you for listening. I'm not going to stop sharing my screen, and in case if you have any questions, we can go over it now. Just
So thank you so much, Sudar, for the session, and it was very informative and very helpful for WordPress developers. And guys, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in chat box below, or if you have any doubts while develop the project in your using composers, feel free to ask in your Twitter handle or ask in our Slack channel.
okay. I think there is one question that. Yeah. So yeah, the question was like, is it similar to package.json for npm? Yes, it's very same. Both npm and Composer kind of follow the same principles. So when you're using npm, you'll actually be using something called package.json file. Similarly, for Composer, we'll be using composer.json file. The overall concept and everything is same, and npm is generally used for front-end dependencies, like your JavaScript libraries and things like that. And on the other hand, Composer is used for your back-end dependencies, like things that you need for your PHP code and things like that. I think there's also another question about, should we lock the version of the packages before we move it to production, or is it okay to use caret versioning range? Okay, so this again depends on mostly on the packages. As I said, if the package is following semantic versioning properly, then it's okay to have the caret version, so that even if there is like a patch version that got released, you would still use that. But in some cases, what happens is like if the library is very important, even if like a small change could actually like affect your code. In those cases, what you can do is like try to go for the exact version. But again, I would say like the general practice is people generally use caret, assuming that the package author, like whoever is deploying that package, like that package author followed semantic versioning properly. I've rarely seen people use like the same exact version for Composer. Yes, there's another question from Vijayan. How can we handle Composer JSON to match with plugin and theme versions if we update plugin using admin dashboard? Okay, so that could be little tricky, because um, in case if you are directly updating the plugin or theme from the WordPress dashboard, right? In that case, what happens is there is no way to actually like let Composer know that there was a change that has happened. So what I would recommend is like if we are using Composer for automatically updating plugins and themes, it would be better to just stick with using Composer instead of automatically updating it through from the WordPress admin. I mean directly, or updating the plugin or theme directly from WordPress admin. But now that you actually asked me, I think there could be some use cases where this could be useful, especially like in your local, right? I mean, if you are in your local machine, you see that there are a lot of updates for a, or there, you see like a lot of plugins have updates in your thing. You don't want to manually like type all the version numbers. It could be easier to just select everything and then update, and then test everything and then push it to production. But as of now, I am not aware of any automatic way by which you could do that. But in case if I find any, I'll probably post about that in Twitter or someplace. But as of now, I don't see a way to do that. Okay. I don't see any other questions. Yeah. So does anybody have any other questions before we wrap this thing up? Yeah, I see another question. Yeah, so somebody posted about dev docs. Yeah, so that's a very useful site. Like in case if we have to search for API documentation and other things, we can actually use that. All right, thanks everyone. I'm gonna stop recording now.